Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Pedagogy series of Brillante, the Nagaland Piano Festival. This is a great initiative taken by Q, and I'd like to thank Q for giving Trinity College London, India, the opportunity to be a part of this series. Today's session is being presented by Anuvrat Choudhary, a young, talented, and dedicated musician. Anuvrat holds a distinction in both the associate and licentiate diplomas of Trinity College London. He hails from Gurgaon in North India and is presently studying piano at Trinity Laban in the UK. His passion for music began at an early age and was honed to perfection by his teacher in Doon School, Miss Priya Chaturvedi. He has been a prize winner at many competitions, including Brillante. Besides performance, he also enjoys teaching young musicians and sharing his knowledge and experience with them, as he will be doing today also. Not that he's old, he's all of 22 years, so a lot that he has achieved in this time, and we really are looking forward to hearing from him. Today's topic, Practicing Productively, is a very relevant one for all musicians, as it is the one area where we find most learners losing their way. I would now, without much ado, like to welcome Anuvrat all the way from Trinity Laban. Over to you, Anuvrat.
Thank you, ma'am, for that introduction. And I would also like to thank Brillante for giving me this opportunity and this platform to conduct this workshop. The reason I chose the workshop on practice is that for a lot of students, usually lessons with their teachers, they happen once or twice a week. For some of them, it even happens once every 2 weeks, depending on how much time they have, how committed they are. And a lot of times, students spend time with themselves and with their own piano at home practicing. And if that practice is not done effectively, you can spend hours and hours, which I have done, and just mindlessly playing the same thing over and over again on auto repeat without actually giving it much thought about why I need to do this or what's going on or how I can work at this actually. And one thing I would just like to ask anybody is that how often do you find yourselves practicing in this manner, that you're working on a piece, you start playing the piece from the beginning, you play till the point where you make a mistake, you stop yourself and try to work on that mistake. And well, sometimes it goes right, sometimes it goes wrong. That happens, you get it right a few times, and then you go on with that piece. I mean, that's an intuitive way for a lot of students who practice. I am guilty of having done that for a long time myself. But that is really not the most effective way of practicing, and it does also. All the time that you're spending just playing that piece over and over again is not actually promoting learning. It's just promoting actually bad piano playing. That becomes playing the piano and not practicing the piano. So if it's possible for everyone, I would just like to, if you could just write it all in the chat, what you think actually practicing is and how is it different from performing or playing the piano.
So please put this in the chat to everyone.
Or if anybody would like to unmute themselves and just speak, that's also, of course, fine.
Yes, I think we're a small group, so we could do that, Anuvrat, right?
Yes.
We could take questions and thoughts in between.
If you can kindly repeat your question again, I think that would be great.
So my question was that I would just like to hear from someone who's been playing the piano about how they practice and what is the difference they think between practicing, performing, and playing the piano. Practicing is learning something, working on something to improve. Siddharth, if I can ask you, I mean, how would you say you would work on something to improve? Because learning something is done in a lot of ways, and working on something to improve. Can you just elaborate that on a little bit?
Siddharth, you could speak if you like.
Sure. Hello. So I meant that if I already know a scale or a technique, I can work on it to improve that. So that's what I meant.
Yes, but my question is how? Like, do you
How?
just play on it again and again, or how do you actually practice it?
Yeah, by playing it again and again is one thing, and another thing is by learning more from the teacher, or just not making the mistakes, correcting the mistakes, and there are many ways.
So, these are like in this workshop, these are some of the ways that I will be addressing today. That how exactly can you practice a passage that is either bothering you or that is technically difficult or musically difficult that you're finding difficult to execute, or you find yourself like getting nervous when performing for your teacher or in a performance. So in this workshop, that's what I will be actually addressing, the how of working on something. Whether it's a piece you've learned, whether it's skills, whether it's etudes that you've learned, or you're learning new pieces. So to break down the how so that you can actually make the most out of your practice sessions. So if I can just elaborate a little bit on the difference between practicing, performing, and playing. Practicing is when you're just sitting with yourself and your piano and your score. You stop yourself again and again. That, all right, I'm going to work on this section, I'm going to learn this section from this piece. And you stop yourself to see what's going on when you're practicing. That, okay, you can't do that in a performance. When you're performing, once you begin the piece, you have to play it all the way through. But in your practice sessions, you can keep on stopping, restarting. You can practice them at different tempos. That, all right, this maybe feels a little too slow, this maybe feels a little too fast. I get too agitated when I come to this section, so maybe I can take it a little slower. And you can experiment in your practice sessions. You can experiment with the pedaling, you can experiment with different fingerings, you can experiment with different touches. So, like, if I'm playing the same C chord, for instance, this, it could be played as or so. I mean, I hope the audio was clear enough that the voicing in that chord, first time I'm bringing the C out. In this, it's the middle note, the E, and so if you've got a piece which, say, has a lot of chords where you need to do a lot of voicing, in a practice session you can stop yourself to listen very carefully, to do that voicing properly, to listen to the sound that you would want to perform, the sound that you would want when you perform that piece. This is something you can't do in a performance. A performance is something, once you've practiced everything, once you've decoded and you've worked at that piece, you just let go and play the whole thing through. Whatever you need to express, you just put in that one performance and you just let the audience listen to it. And the last kind, playing, which I mentioned earlier, is something one should do for fun. Like, once you've learned a piece, you can just play with it, try different tempos and not really worrying about it. But playing is usually what happens in a lot of practice sessions and in a lot of practice rooms, where you're just playing from the beginning all the way until you make a mistake, until you try and work on that mistake. So the first thing I would recommend to actually make your practice sessions most effective is to have a practice diary. Can I ask the audience if anybody actually has a practice diary? And if anybody's maintained a practice diary, and if anybody knows what a practice diary is and how to make use of it.
Hi.
Hi.
This is Palak. Yeah, actually, I like to practice like first, I will do very slowly. I first practice the notes. I learn the notes. I memorize the notes. And then I practice the piece at a very slow tempo, and then I increase it. I play it at medium tempo so that I don't rush. And then when I start playing fast, and then I go through the piece again to just check if I'm not playing any wrong notes, and I just play exercises so that I can improve my technique and put dynamics on the piece and make it more expressive and different.
Thank you, Palak. So yes, that is one way to practice. You learn a piece, you learn the notes, you learn it slow, you start pushing the tempo up so that you don't rush, you gradually push it up. But gradually, with a few pieces, there comes a time when, well, say you're practicing with the metronome, you start learning at the metronome tempo of 80. You want to get it up to 120, but at 100 or 110, you kind of find yourself with that barrier you cannot cross. Like, I want to maybe play it faster, and I think I should play it faster. I think the piece needs to be interpreted in that way that it should be played faster. So, when pushing the tempo up, also when you're learning piece from a slow to a faster tempo, there are ways and ways of doing it, which I will get to. But I would like to go back to my point about a practice diary, which is that for students it is like a musical journal. So when you're going into practice, say you're going to practice for the next 1 hour, one has to have a plan in mind that, okay, in this piece, if I'm learning this sonata, I'm going to work on the first 20 bars of it, and that's it. If I'm working on, say, the D major scale, I'm going to be working on the D major scale, I'm going to be working on it for 2 octaves, I'm going to learn how to practice it piano and forte. This plan is necessary. Otherwise, as I said earlier, you just go in the room, you start playing things over and over again without actually any goal and having to achieve very little from your practice sessions. And a musical journal also helps you, or this practice diary. After you've made your plan, you go in the room, you start practicing, you see, okay, with this D major scale or with this part, I'm having a problem with this fingering or I'm having a problem with this turn. And this needs to be addressed, which you do at a slower tempo, you do it at different tempos, you try different fingerings. If you still cannot work that out, it can be very, very useful to have a question section for your teachers that, okay, I'm having problems with this, so that as soon as you go in for your next lesson, you can actually go to your teacher and say, I'm having problems with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That these are immediate problems which I do need to address with you. So that in your lessons with your teachers, which if it's say 1 hour a week, you do not spend 20 minutes actually finding what the problem is. So these journals actually help you self-diagnose your problems or find out for yourself what you're having difficulties with, so that you can make the most out of your lessons with your teachers also. And after you've done your practice based on that plan, after having made questions for your teachers or these are the problems I'm having, you can make what the assessment or from your practice session was. So it's like, I'm just going to hold this up. So if I have this little section, where the first part is the plan, next part is where I'm judging what's wrong with my playing. This, whatever assessment that you've made, becomes the plan for your next session. So it's like, these are the things I need to address. These are the issues I've faced. And after having discussed with your teacher, that also feeds into your next plan. This makes your practice sessions a lot more organized, and the how of working. You learn whatever difficulties you're having with the piece of music, you are a lot more engaged with that. And it's a lot clearer, the parts that you need to work on, the parts that need to be addressed. And one way I will do that is, I think, I might just demonstrate with a little bagatelle. Anjli ma'am, could you please share that score? It's Beethoven's Bagatelle Opus 126, the last one in E flat major. And the opening of this Bagatelle is presto with that run. And let me just play the beginning of this Bagatelle. So, most of you can say that opening, it's kind of forte, it's presto, the left hand chords, they're pretty loud, but they can't be that loud that it overpowers the right hand. So this short piece already has a lot of complexities in it. And when practicing this scale, it's not just enough to learn the notes, work out the fingerings. The scale also needs to be completely even, because it's just kind of a bold statement that Beethoven's made here. And a few ways of practicing this run. Is that you could take that scale in different rhythms. And this was the rhythms in 2. So if you're doing it, you have to do it the other way around also. It is a lot trickier when you start playing around with these different rhythms. And this was rhythms in 2. You could do it in 3s. And if you're doing it in rhythms of 3, there's 3 different ways of playing it. If you're doing it in rhythms of 4, there's 4 different ways of playing it. And practicing it in different rhythms is one way of practicing it. You would practice it in groups, so that, say you divide the whole bar up into 2 groups, and you stop at the beginning of each group of 4 note. The first one will be 3 notes because the first note is the rest. So and you could be stopping on different notes. Then you could make the group slightly larger. From 4 notes, you could make it to 8 notes. Now, I just noticed that the few times I've played this scale, if you look at bar 1, the second half of the bar, which has the E flat, F, G, and the E flat, this is a slightly awkward turn. So if I'm playing the whole thing just again and again and again and again, at forte with the left hand, at tempo, and just trying to get it right, I would never be able to narrow it down to the fact that in the first bar, the second half, this is the turn I'm having a difficulty with, or that this is the awkward turn. So having a practice diary, making a plan that, all right, in this practice session for the first 15 minutes, I'm going to be addressing just the first opening statement of this bagatelle or whatever piece you're playing, can actually help you to organize your practice sessions to actually figure out what exactly in that whole passage is going wrong, or what exactly is the problem that you're having. And once I've got this problem sorted out, it would be a lot easier for me to put the whole thing together. So, does anybody have any questions about a practice diary at this point?
So what
I
all
guess
needs
no
to be
one.
written
Yeah,
in the
sorry.
diary? It's fine. Once before going to the practice, what should we practice, and after the practice, what did we accomplish, or is there any problem?
Yes.
I think if you can hold up, Anuvrat, that sheet, it'll make it
Yes.
quite clear what needs to be written.
Yes. So
It's on the right.
yes, the first part is the plan. So Siddharth, you actually made a very good point about seeing what you accomplish also. So I have to say it is important to actually congratulate yourself also when you get something right, when you're happy with something, and tell your teachers that, okay, I'm happy with this section, what do you think about it? So it's not just always important to focus on what's going wrong, but also to kind of like pat yourself on the back if you've gotten something right. So the first part is your plan, that I want to practice, say 1, 2, and 3 things. The next part is the judge. You see that, okay, in the first thing, this is what went right, this is what wasn't okay, second and third. Then you ask your teachers the questions, and from that feedback that you've given yourself becomes the plan for your next practice session. So I will say that, okay, it is something new, it is different, and it's difficult to get started with it right from the beginning. And I mean, even I think the first time I started it, I could not keep it up for more than 2 or 3 days. And I restarted then making the practice diary because it was a lot more useful. And I've kept it up. So it's like, it does get easier just because you make short forms for yourself, like H3 for hands together, left hand LH, or whatever. It gets a lot easier because you learn how you express your problems also and how to write it down for yourself. So even the practice diary, although it might be a little time consuming right in the beginning, it will, I can promise you this much, a practice diary will actually save you a lot more time than just going to your practice sessions without any plan, any goal, and just sitting there and playing things through over and over and over again. Any other questions about the practice diary? So if you do have questions, feel free to drop it in the chat and I will address it later. So why is this practice diary important? Because I have mentioned this a few times earlier, but it is to actually prevent practicing mindlessly. And when you're practicing mindlessly, it's like your brain does not know what's going on with your fingers. Your brain, your fingers, your breathing and all of that are not in coordination together. And when you go up there to perform on a stage or in front of an audience or in an exam, they are all working at hyper speed and suddenly everything feels off. So practicing mindlessly actually will cause a lot more problems, and these different ways of practicing will make you a lot more secure with your playing. And I would just like to do this one experiment before I continue. You don't have to do it on the camera, just if everybody could get a piece of paper, a pencil and an eraser, that would be very helpful. Once you've got it, just please just write in the chat to let me know that you've got it, and I'll continue from there. Just a piece of paper, a pencil and an eraser.
So do we all have it?
Yes.
Absolute silence. Have you got any yeses?
Yes.
You do?
Okay.
Okay, Siddharth, Faith.
Yes, I think a lot of us have the erasers and pencils. So,
Yes.
can I ask you to take the pencil and just, on a piece of paper, just write something down? Write error, write your name, write mistake, whatever you want to. Just write something down. And now try and erase it with the eraser. Try very hard to get it completely clean the way the paper was originally. Like, scrub it out, but it should be, try and get it completely clean the way the paper originally was. Did anybody manage to get that? I don't think so, because after
No.
having put something down, once you start to erase it, it leaves that little imprint behind. It always does. And it might be a lighter imprint for some others, it might be a stronger imprint for some others. So, what that basically kind of shows is that when you're learning a new piece or when you're practicing something, and it's very easy to kind of have a slip of your hand like you did on the piece of paper, or to just not focus on what you're doing and just practice. And those mistakes, those errors get embedded in your playing. Those errors are really hard to undo and then relearn new things or like correct those mistakes. It is much easier to make those plans, spend a little time with a piece of music that you're learning, and go ahead with it with a plan so that those errors don't happen in the first place and you're a lot more secure with what you've done right from the beginning. Because, I mean, it's a very small example, but it illustrates the point that once you've gotten something down, if you try to undo it, there will always be that little imprint left. And I have numerous examples from various pieces I've played for years. And as soon as I go back to perform it, even after having noticed that error, that thing that I've learned incorrectly, in a performance, that mistake comes back. So, planning ahead is like analyzing a piece. It's like you see the piece right from the beginning before you actually start to learn it. And you look through it before going ahead with it so that you know what's actually coming later in the piece. So I think for this I would like to use a slightly simple example which everybody could even try out right now, which is, and a lot of people might have played it, the Bach Minuet, which is that it's a short piece, yes, but well, there are a lot of nuances in it, and there's barely any dynamic markings, there's barely any phrasing, any articulation markings. So there's actually a whole lot of different ways to play it. So if I just take the first line, just the first. I mean, that's one way to play it. I played it slightly further this time. I could have played it softer completely. And in a practice session, once you've kind of seen what the piece is like, these are the things you can experiment with. Like, okay, I want to make the second bar even shorter. You don't have to do that, but that's one way of playing it, because in a lot of music, there are repeats, there's repetition, there's sequences. And if you're playing all of it the same way, it does get very monotonous and very boring for the listener. It's hard for the performer. As a performer, you need to basically capture your listener's attention. they need to be paying attention to the music that they're playing and not thinking about when is this going to get over and what I'm going to have for dinner once I get back home. So when practicing ahead, you can look at the score. You can see, okay, there's that little mordant in bar 3, there's that little mordant in bar 5, there's in bar 8, there's that. How sharp am I going to make this? And the reason this is important is that this is a short piece, but with much longer sonatas. There are sections in that sonata which are much harder than the rest of the piece. So you can prepare for some of those technical difficulties ahead of time. So ma'am, if you could just show the Beethoven Sonata Opus 111. And if we could skip right till the end, all the way till the end.
Yeah, I just get it.
So this Opus 111, a lot of you might know this work. If you don't, please do go listen to it. It's a fantastic piece of music. It's the last sonata Beethoven wrote.
So do you want it, where do you want it from?
Slightly up if you could go.
Okay.
And yes, that's it, I think.
The last page?
So, yes, from there is fine. So that last page, this last section, has this incredibly long trill. And this is a very long trill at the end of a 25-minute long work. And it's a pianissimo trill with the left hand doing stuff in very complicated, awkward rhythms in threes, in triplets. And the right hand is filling in the notes with the middle voice. And the trill is actually played very often with your 3-5 and your 4th and the 5th finger, which is a very difficult. From a technical point of view, it was a very new technique for me. I started learning this piece a few months ago, I think 2 or 3 months ago. But I studied the piece beforehand. I knew when I'm going to learn this, I'm going to come across this as a technical problem later. So right from the beginning, I just isolated this little section and I was just working on this trill with my 3rd and 5th finger. And when I say I was working on this, I was practicing this in many different ways. I was trying different touches, I was trying different hand positions, if this is better, or if this is better. Along with the screen share, is my video also there on the screen for people to watch? I don't know.
Yeah, shall I keep the share or remove it?
Is my video visible or no?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, then it's fine. So, like with this trill, I was experimenting with different touches, different ways of playing it. When playing the trill, can I just keep moving my hand up and down like this to kind of keep my arm relaxed? And if I were to play this trill, how do I get it even more even? Because this is kind of like just some kind of heavenly bells just ringing in the background when there's all of this going on. And just planning this ahead in the last 2 months, once I learned this piece, once I got to this section, this trill was a lot more under my control. And if I would have started learning this trill right now, it would have taken me another few weeks at least, if not longer, to actually become comfortable with this trill. So when you're studying a longer piece ahead of time, you can isolate those difficult sections, you can isolate those passages which you might face a problem with. and you can start learning them ahead of time. This is a very good idea to do with longer pieces, with some of the etudes, the Chopin etudes, the Liszt etudes, where there's a particular kind of technique you're going to need to do. So recently I started working on this chromatic etude, Opus 10 number 2. It's just this, so because I've not really played chromatics with my 3rd, 4th, 5th finger, what I'm doing right now, it's just been 2 days since I started learning this, but I'm isolating, just practicing the chromatic with my 3, 4 and 5. And once I'm comfortable with this, I will then move on to the etude, start learning the top voice and then the middle voice and then the lower voice, put it all together at a slow tempo, push it at a faster tempo, practicing it in different rhythms, and just preparing for these actually also goes into then your plan. That, all right, I'm going to be working on Beethoven's Sonata Opus 111, so I'm going to work on the first movement and I'm going to spend 5 or 10 minutes on the trill today. Or factoring in sight reading in your practicing. It is a very good idea to at least, well, if you're practicing 7 days a week, at least do your sight reading 2 or 3 times a day. Because when you suddenly say you need to accompany a vocalist or you've got a very short time to learn a piece, having good sight reading skills comes in very handy. So, when you're learning a piece, it is a good idea to just sit with the score before you learn it. Just study the score. I don't know, we do have some time. To study the score, see what the dynamics are, what the dynamic range is, because, well, a Beethoven's piano is, piano as in the dynamic markings, piano and forte, is not the same as a Chopin's piano and forte, which is not the same as, say, a Nikolai Kapustin's contemporary piano and forte. So, all of these things, once you've got it in your head, once you've got those ideas about how to play, a lot of the technically difficult passages that one might find also become much easier. Because you know, you have an idea, you have a direction that you would want to give the music, which would also simplify that music for you. Does anybody have a question at this point?
Can you repeat what did you say about the forte piano and all what the dynamic range? I just need to write it down.
So what I meant was that Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, and contemporary composers now, Kapustin, Schoenberg and all, they all worked on different pianos. Like this minuet. Bach never had a piano to write it on. He wrote it on a harpsichord. He never had that kind of a dynamic range which a modern piano provides. So if Bach wanted to say do this, he could not because his instrument would not let him. Right, so a Bach piano and forte, those dynamics are different from a Chopin's piano and forte, which is different from a Beethoven's piano and forte also. And even within a piece, not all fortes are the same. It's like some parts are a lot more energetic, they are a lot more like full of energy, brio, bravura, or fire, and they need to be played slightly differently from slightly gentler fortes. So once you've got the idea about that, okay, so let me take an example from the first movement of the Beethoven Sonata. I'll just play it, I don't think the score is needed. And this is just, it's a fugue within the sonata. And this fugue is marked forte. And there's two things going on. One is the running passages. They're both marked forte, but if you listen to it, if you try to study the work before, the voice or the melodic line is actually this. So the running passages, you do not need to work that hard to make those running passages that loud. It's not musically appropriate, it will tire you out, it makes you slower to play all of those running passages that loud with that much force and that much effort. So even within a piece, once you study those dynamics, once you study those phrasings, once you study where the voices are, you can actually approach that piece in a lot more different way, which if I were to play this whole section completely forte, it would exhaust me and I would have many technical problems. But because I studied this, because I know where the voices are, what I need to bring out, I could have, which I did, and it does not take away anything from the music because the voices are still being brought out. And so on. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Moving on to one of the last few things I would like to address is that in the last 1 year, 2 years, I've had to record myself a lot more because of COVID, because there weren't live performances happening. And recording yourself is a very useful practice tool. So in the practice diary, when I was saying assess yourself, one of the ways to do that is to just record yourself. At the end of your practice session or once you worked on a certain passage, just record yourself playing it and listen back to it. It does not need to be with a high-end camera and a microphone, your phone's fine. But when you're not playing, you're not anxious about getting the notes, getting this dynamic, you can just listen to yourself playing and see, because once you've studied a piece, once you've got that idea in your head, a lot of times you actually think you're playing a note, but that note is actually not being played. So when you record yourself and listen back to it with your score, you can isolate, okay, maybe this wasn't as good as I thought it was, or maybe, oh, this actually sounds a lot nicer than I thought. I was worried about this, but it's not actually that bad. So recording is actually a very useful tool for practicing. And the last thing I would like to address is pedaling, which is something that a lot of pianists overuse. And one of the reasons is because they're insecure with what the music actually is about. They're not sure where the melody is going, which direction is it going, where do I want it to lead to. So a lot of it gets clouded by the pedal. So in your practice sessions, I use this in the beginning, that one needs to experiment. You should experiment with different pedalings, different types of pedaling, half pedal, quarter pedal, fully pressing it down. How often do you want to bring it up? Do you want to bring it all the way back up? And there's no such thing as starting pedaling too early or too late. It's just pedaling is done not with your feet, but it's actually done with your ears. So you need to listen to the sound that's being produced. And your feet need to kind of follow that sound. Like, pedaling does not really need to be done with your feet. You have to have an idea about the sound that you want to get to be able to pedal properly. The last thing is that when practicing, one does not need to practice for like 6 hours a day at one stretch. It is much better to practice for shorter durations. If you're practicing, say you're going to school, you've got some time, not that much time, you've got lessons on weekends, it is not most effective to practice just on Saturdays for 10 hours a day and every Saturday for 10 hours. It is much better to practice for 20 minutes a day. And in those 20 minutes, if you have that plan, if you've got, okay, I need to practice 1, 2, 3, 4 things, and you kind of divide your time up like that, a 20-minute practice session will be a lot more useful and a lot more effective than a 2-hour unplanned practice session. Practice for 20, 25 minutes, 30 minutes, take a 5-minute break, take a 10-minute break, go walk, come back if you want to practice. If you're practicing for, say, 2 hours, if you want to practice for 2 hours, practice for 25 minutes, take a 5-minute break, maybe think about the practice, maybe go, I don't know, have a coffee, have a juice, eat something, come back, practice again, take a short break again. So one needs to practice in shorter sections, even if you've planned to practice for 2 hours. Just practicing in short durations, which is going to make your brain also a lot more attentive when you're playing and when you're practicing. That, all right. Otherwise, the brain kind of gets saturated, it gets completely exhausted, and then it shuts down. Then that coordination between your brain and your hands and your fingers is completely gone. And that would then lead to unfruitful practice, which would not only would it not do you good, it would actually harm you. So practicing incorrectly actually harms you. It is not even like it's zero and it's better. It's actually a negative effect on your practicing. So I think I will open everything for people to ask questions that they have about this. If they've got any particular passages in a piece or a particular way, or say it's chords passage or something that they would like to address, please feel free to ask me questions.
Thank you, Anuvrat. That was really useful, and I'm sure all of you have learned a lot from it. Just to summarize, Anuvrat said, practice journal, really important. Take out the time to keep that and maintain it. It's going to help you move a long way. Your practice needs to be mindful, and you do need to self-evaluate. Today we record. We are on to online classes, so we know the importance of recording, but then listening to yourself and trying to evaluate what you have done in that practice session is as important as performing. And of course, don't injure yourself, short durations. We need to be very careful about physical injury. Pianists, especially all musicians, are prone to it if you don't practice properly. So now we can have some questions. Is there anything I left out, Anuvrat? I just summarized everything.
Thank you so much for doing that, and thank you for adding the point about injuries, which was actually where the idea of practicing in short duration stemmed from. And because piano practicing, a lot of it is very repetitive in nature, it uses the same muscles. Doing that over and over and over again for a long time can actually injure you. So thank you, ma'am, for bringing that up.
So we're open to questions now. Anything you want to ask, you're having a problem with, please go ahead. We have about 5-6 minutes.
Okay. Hi, Anuvrat. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't think anyone can hear me, no?
I think I can, yes.
We can hear you, Q, loud and clear.
Oh, sorry, I can't hear you. If you had just 20 minutes in a day to practice, what would you choose to practice? What would you do?
I mean, so if I only had 20 minutes in a day, I would just prioritize on, so I would spend a little time on kind of like things that I might have a technical problem with. So right now I'm working on a lot of the Chopin etudes. So if I were practicing just for 20 minutes, I would spend 5 minutes on just a little section from the Chopin etude, whatever I would want to work on. Then if I'm working towards a program, because I've got a competition coming up in a few weeks, so I'm preparing the whole Beethoven sonata for it. So I have 15 minutes remaining for which I need to play the whole Beethoven sonata, so I would be spending that time. The whole sonata is 30 minutes long, so I cannot perform it in the remaining 15 minutes. So I would maybe take that ending trill which needs to be worked on. It's at the end. I need to be a lot more secure with the endings. Then the fugues in the first movement. I would just isolate those parts, which I think might be troublesome. Or if I'm practicing just for 20 minutes and I'm at a much earlier stage and working on my initial grade 1 or something, I could just work on, okay, today I want to perform one piece, but the other 2 pieces I'm just going to work on, say, 5 bars, 4 bars in this piece. and I could just work for the whole thing on one piece, some scales, some of the sight reading, some exercises, if one's working towards an exam. So it's just whatever I would do, I would just plan it and break my session up so that, okay, I want to get this, this, and this out from my practice session.
So actually practicing correctly and selectively also is one whole topic that one can be discussing really, because how does a student, he is a student after all, he's not the teacher, select what he needs to practice. So it all again comes down to your self-evaluation. And of course, you could put it to your teacher that I don't have more than this much time. What do you think I should practice in that much time? What do you think, according to you, needs work? So that could also work, because some decisions the younger children can't take themselves.
That's right.
Anyone else with questions?
So there are so many scales and chords to practice. So how should we practice scales and chords? Like practicing a scale for a month long and then moving on to another scale, or like practicing many scales simultaneously, and same goes for chords.
So I would suggest that you practice scales and chords together, because they're two different kinds of movements. So when you're, say, practicing the same scale for a few minutes, instead of overusing those muscles, you can actually switch to the chords of that same scale, which would switch up your hand movements. It would also prevent injuries. And going ahead from that, I think you should practice scales and chords together if you are practicing those. And it would be a good idea to practice multiple scales. I'm not saying practice all 24 of them at the same time, but practice a few of them which have slightly different hand movements, which have slightly different shapes. So for instance, I think the D flat major scale has a completely different, or the D flat or G flat major scale has a completely different movement from the D major or the B flat major scale. Right, so if you mix those up, your practice will actually use a different kind of a hand movement. And with your scales and chords, if you're practicing them, one good idea is to maybe practice them for a few minutes right in the beginning, just to get your fingers warmed up, but that is more like a warm-up. If you're practicing scales as scales for an exam, that cannot be a part of your warm-up. So if I'm practicing the Chopin etudes, which is something I'm doing for both technique and my musical growth, I would practice exercises of the etudes as a part somewhat of my warm-up, but later I would practice those same exercises as my practice. So I would suggest you mix up a few scales which use different hand movements, so that, and your chords, you mix it in with the scales, so that you don't overuse the same muscles. Hopefully that answered your question.
Any other questions, anybody? So I guess if everyone's happy, we can close the meeting webinar now. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And thank you, Kyo, for giving us this opportunity, and the attendees the opportunity to participate in this great workshop. And Anuvrat, thank you so much. We wish you very well in your musical journey. It was so nice to hear from somebody young who has not a lot of experience, but a lot of expertise, and would be able to share things right on the ground level for students, rather than, people who are very, very experienced and expect everybody to know it all. Thank you, Anuvrat. Thank you, Kyo, for organizing this. And thank you all for attending. Bye-bye. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.